I'm in the Cavalry and Guards Club in London to speak with Gill Bennett today, former Chief Historian of the Foreign Office, and we're going to share the secrets of the conspiracy that never dies. Gill, thank you for joining me today. What is this conspiracy that refuses to die? Because you've done a lot of work on it, haven't you?
I have, and the conspiracy in question is to do with the Zinoviev Letter of 1924. As a historian within the Foreign Office, one of your jobs is to deal with conspiracies, because people are always saying that governments are conspiring, covering up. And so one of the things the historians do is deal with this kind of thing and try to explain. And this is a conspiracy that never goes away, despite the fact that the letter was written in 1924. I did actually write this book on it in 2018, but actually I first came across working on the conspiracy in 1972. I should explain what the Zinoviev Letter was. It was a letter which was supposedly written by Grigory Zinoviev, who was the head of the Comintern, the Bolshevik government's propaganda arm, addressed to the British Communist Party. Now, there was nothing very surprising about that, exhorting them to greater revolutionary effort, because the Comintern were always writing to communist parties all over the world, encouraging them to follow the Soviet example and overthrow the government. However, the real significance of this in conspiratorial terms is when it was sent, which was just at the end of the very first ever Labour government in Britain. Now, in fact, the letter's dated the 15th of September, but it didn't actually arrive in the Secret Intelligence Service, which is how it came in, until the 8th of October, which was the day that Ramsay MacDonald, first Labour Prime Minister, had resigned after losing a vote of no confidence. So this letter arrives in Britain during a general election campaign, and it was leaked. There are all kinds of people who may have leaked it, that's part of the conspiracy, but it was picked up by the right-wing Tory press and used to damage the Labour Party. Now, the Labour Party would have lost the election anyway for other reasons, but it certainly hit their vote. It was very much taken to heart. The Labour Party regarded it as being a plot against them, in which the government, the Tory government, in which the civil service, in which the intelligence services were all involved. But this is 1924, so you have to think, how is it still going on now? Well, part of the reason is that it came up in almost every election, general election campaign after that, where Labour would say, you're not doing that to us again, and the Tories would say, well, you're just carrying on the same way. There were a lot of different investigations into it. And in the 1960s, that's one that we should mention, because after Kim Philby disappeared to Moscow, this really sent shockwaves through the British intelligence establishment, particularly, of course, the Secret Intelligence Service, where he had been a senior officer until 1951, and they had always refused to believe that he could be a Soviet agent, despite the evidence. So when he actually proved it by disappearing, really there was a sense of shock, and there was also a sense of shock within MI5 as well about, well, if all this was going on, nobody knew, what else might there have been? Might there be other moles, if you like, or operations that had gone wrong because of the spies, the Cambridge spies, within the intelligence establishment. So there was a major investigation, a secret investigation, but across the agencies in the late 1960s, headed by a lady called Millicent Baggott, who was a Soviet expert from MI5, and she published a report, and she concluded that the letter was almost certainly forged, though she couldn't say for certain by whom. And it was certainly leaked, but there were so many people who might have leaked it that you couldn't be quite sure. Now, I came into the Foreign Office in 1972 and found that this was still something that people talked about. And it came and went and came and went. And then in the 1990s, in 1998, a book was published. It's perhaps worth mentioning in this context that after the end of the Cold War, one of the Russian intelligence aims was to try and get some more of their history out. And the Russian intelligence involved in publishing several joint books with Western historians on a range of subjects. And they did some. There was a man called, he's now dead actually, but he had been a KGB colonel, Zinoviev, and he published a book with Nigel West, or Rupert Allison, the Conservative MP, but he wrote Nigel West, which called The Crown Jewels, which purported to be based on materials that Philby and other traitors had given to Moscow. And it had a chapter on the Zinoviev Letter.
Interesting.
Now, this is the beginning of another new Labour government, and it caused quite an outcry in Parliament, much to the astonishment of Robin Cook, who was then Foreign Secretary. He thought that 1924, surely nobody's bothering about that, but he soon found from his post bag that it was still a sore spot in Labour, in the Labour Party, and that there were still people who wanted to know about it. And so he commissioned an investigation into it. And by this time, I'm chief historian, so it was my job, based on, obviously, access to the archives of our intelligence agencies. So that was my first big exposure to it, and a report was published in 1999, which largely, in a sense, I said the same thing as Millicent Baggott.
Yeah.
I'm pretty well sure it was forged, but it's pretty difficult to say by who. It still came back again. It came up again during discussions in Parliament of the legislation which put British intelligence agencies on a statutory basis. It came up every time we had a general election. It came up during the European referendum campaign.
Yes, I remember that.
In 2016. So it was one of those things, and my agent said to me, really, there is still an interest in this. You should actually write it up based on what you know now. Now, in a sense, I'm still not able to lay this to bed. However, I do now think there's a fairly hot suspect who was a man called Ivan Pokrovsky. Now, he had been a white Russian. He'd served in the Tsarist army, and like a lot of other people, he was involved in trying to get at the Bolsheviks, so to speak. He may have been involved in the forgery. But why the Zinoviev conspiracy has become even more potent today is because it is a classic fake news, disinformation thing, which of course is something we are all talking about at the moment.
Yes, so we've got the election, in America,
yes.
But even in European...
Yes, interference in elections.
In everything.
And
so
although
topical.
it is of course true that today, in a digital world, a story can go around the world in half a second. And obviously that was not true in the 1920s, but it was amazing how fast the Russians, both red and white, i.e. in favour and against Bolsheviks, could actually put a story out round the world, even in 1924. There was an amazing character called Vladimir Orlov, who was based in Berlin, and he ran a forgery bureau, and he forged Russian documents, and he sold them to a range of people, including British intelligence, and he could move this stuff around the world incredibly quickly. It was fake news. And in the same way that today, Russian disinformation, of which we now know quite a lot, is often aimed at disruption,
Yes.
For the hell of it, if you like, rather than at a specific outcome. That was rather the same in the 1920s, because by the mid-1920s, after Lenin had died, Stalin was accepting that actually world revolution was not going to happen imminently. But therefore, what you wanted to do was disrupt Western democracy rather than necessarily overthrow it. And, if you like, state disinformation served the same kind of purpose. So it retains its potency in the discussions that we have today about things like disinformation, election interference, fake news of all sorts. So it may be, in a way I'm disappointed not to have ever been able to nail it. But it is really too long ago for the hard evidence to be obtainable. I'm not sure if it exists, but it's still a story that has surprising resonance, even nearly 100 years later.
And so do you have a view yourself on how to make a contemporary analogy between this political and fake news and intelligence, how to deal with this? How do you think is the effective way? Because, as you say, mixed into this, you've got all the whole conspiracy thing, which is not helpful.
Yeah.
How should we deal with that in today's society?
It's almost impossible, as it was then, to actually stop. You can't stop people doing. It's not only Russia. Other people do it too. So you have to build resilience in the people who are receiving it, really. The best, as everybody would say, the best kind of medicine for conspiracy theory is transparency, is putting the real evidence out there and explaining it as clearly as possible. One of the difficulties in the 1920s, when this letter hit British politics, was, of course, that it became very much a party political issue, and the question of was there a secret state, was there a deep state, though they didn't use that term then, but it's the same thing. Was there a secret state stitching up Labour? Now, we are now able, on the basis of the evidence we do have, to show that actually the idea of a kind of Whitehall-wide conspiracy to do anything is really a contradiction in terms. Clearly, I always say this when I'm giving talks, it's impossible. Yeah. It's hard enough to get a few people in a department to agree, never mind the whole of Whitehall. It just isn't how things work. And certainly these days, the major secret that we know that Bletchley Park, for example, was able to keep for so long was due to very particular circumstances which you could no longer do. You couldn't keep a secret like that. But I do think we all need to be more resilient, more discerning, more questioning about what we look at. And one of the things that I've been doing work on is applying the lessons, if you like, of intelligence analysis to dealing with things like the Zinoviev Letter or its modern equivalent. Thinking, well, first of all, you ask, where does this come from? Do we think it's real? And if it is real, why do we think that the people on the other side might have done it? And what do we think they might want to achieve? And that's very important, because what you want to avoid are things like mirror imaging, that is, expecting that the other people are going to think the same as you are.
Yes.
Confirmation bias, just only accepting bits of information that agree with what you already think. All this is extremely relevant to dealing with, especially social media. And it's the kind of thing, they didn't use those terms in the 1920s, but when various investigations into the Zinoviev Letter have taken place, people have tried to look at it that way, and it's our best defence against the whole disinformation area that we're all dealing with at the moment.
And I suppose that's something that's of relevance not only to the civilian agencies, but to military intelligence as well. And there's a link, isn't there?
There's very much a link. One of the things about it actually in the 1920s and so on, of course, is that the letter was actually circulated to all the general commands. And unfortunately, one has to say that it's quite likely that it was one of them that leaked it. But because, in the 1920s, you're talking with about a much smaller group of people. senior military people tended to be very conservative, not inevitably, but it was quite. But also you're talking about a very tight-knit group. Senior military, senior people in the intelligence agencies, senior people in the civil service, senior people who owned newspapers. These are a group of people who went to school together,
yes, of course,
married each other's sisters, belonged to the same club, meet each other socially. It's a very small world in the 20s and even in the 30s to some extent. So the potential for a conspiracy theory to spread in that is quite marked. And that, of course, applies to the military as well. They were also, and so, for example, there's another little episode which is relevant to this in 1927, when the premises of Arcos, that is the organisation that represented Soviet trade in this country, were raided by MI5 and the Metropolitan Police. And what precipitated the raid was actually the intelligence they'd received that somebody in there had got hold of a military manual. The military manual itself was not particularly secret, but the impact of thinking that the Russians might actually have official military documents was very explosive in those days. And, people worked, they were all the same kind of people. They all knew one another. So, yes, it does have a military dimension. And the same thing applies now. I mean, there's been concern, and I've read about this, about some of the things that our serving military today are exposed to in terms of pernicious material on social media and so on, spreading certain conspiracy theories. So it's the idea that you need a serious strategy for building resilience and countering conspiracy theory is just as important. It's extremely important. And actually, an episode like the Zinoviev Letter has lessons for us even today.
Yes, I was going to ask that finally. So you think very much so that history is, in fact, it's not a dead subject. It's something which is relevant to us today.
It is, I can attest to the fact that very much so, government still very much needs history. Now, it's not to say, people have a funny idea about what official historian, people like me who work for government say. It's not that a minister will say to you, what happened on this occasion, and you say, well, it was that, and so don't do that. It doesn't work that way. You learn, nothing is ever quite the same. But you can learn lessons about how to deal with things, how certain things that happened in the past did work or didn't work, and how therefore you build on it. But each circumstance is different. But it's not, you don't produce a nice kind of 20-page memorandum on the Suez crisis. That's not how things work. But very much with, as we found in 1998, as Robin Cook found with the Zinoviev Letter, it actually matters how you talk about secret things to the public. It actually matters how you deal with them. How governments deal with secrecy matters to the military. It matters to everybody. So you're not following what went before, but you can certainly learn lessons from it.
Oh, Gill, that's been fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing the secrets of the conspiracy that refuses to die.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been a production for the National Centre for Military Intelligence. To find out more and to support the NCMI, please visit ncmi.co.uk.